Well, thanks for having me. My name is Baskut Tuncak. I'm the director of the Toxics Use Reduction Institute, otherwise known as TURI. I'm also a research professor here at University of Massachusetts Lowell.
Tell me the history of this institute. What led to the emergence of this institute?
Well, I think a lot of the impetus came from cases of contamination around the state and the country and the world. In the 80s, instances where communities were predictably and preventably poisoned, essentially, by toxic chemicals that were indiscriminately disposed in their neighborhoods and communities. One such case was here, not far from Boston, in the community of Woburn, where the community had a higher rate of childhood cancers and eventually that was linked to the presence of various toxic chemicals, in particular halogenated solvents that were dumped in streams and woods and such in the area by industry. And that, together with the impetus for better approaches to waste management, led to the creation of something that is now known as the Toxics Use Reduction Act of 1989. Over 35 years ago, Massachusetts passed what is essentially a common sense piece of legislation, but really groundbreaking and really a model. It truly is a model for other countries, other regions around the world.
So over the years now, what will you say the Institute has been able to impressively achieve that you are proudest of?
Gosh, I think the one thing that really stands out to me, there are so many case studies that this institute has worked on, so many things that it should be proud of, but I think the thing that really stands out to me is that it has demonstrated that safer alternatives, safer solutions exist to toxic chemicals. We are hopelessly caught in a state of paralysis. We can do something about this. We can innovate. We can find safer alternatives. We can find uses for which we don't need these toxic chemicals. We can find safer alternatives in any myriad of ways, whether it's a safer chemical or a non-chemical, quote-unquote, alternative. This is a problem that we are more than capable of solving. The thing that also strikes me in that work that this institute has done is that a lot of this has come not as a result of regulatory mandates coming from the U.S., which is not known for banning toxic chemicals, especially at the national level, but it has come from companies and others either doing the math and seeing that, yes, the safer alternative actually makes economic sense for us, where our competitiveness is improving, or from leaders in the business communities standing up and saying, we don't have to do it this way. We can do it a better way. We can protect our communities. We can protect our workers by using this alternative, and that is something that we should do. We have a moral obligation to do, an ethical obligation to do that, and we're going to make that change.
How do you see the Institute being positioned in the bigger scheme of this green economy? What role do you currently think the Institute is comfortably playing?
I think people here go about their work on a day-to-day basis. We don't really take too much time to reflect on how we fit into the broader scheme of things, It's like this company needs help finding an alternative to this solvent. We got to deliver for them. And people here are incredibly dedicated. This institute has had people working here at TURI for 20 years, 25 years, some over 30 years. And it's that sort of institutional knowledge that makes TURI exceptional, I think, along with its incredibly dedicated staff. But having this unique combination of institutional knowledge, incredibly skilled people technically, and just the dedication to fighting this problem that we're facing globally has really done an amazing contribution globally. It's hard to say that we see ourselves as playing this role or that role. It's just what we do.
So how does it work? Does a company come to you like, we have this problem, can you help us solve it? Or do you reach out to them and say, okay, we have this approach that we think will be safer? Because I'm trying to look at this as a potential approach to understanding the model of engaging the private sector. So how does the engagement work between you and them?
So there's any number of ways to which we are engaged to work on a particular situation or the issues confronting a community or a company. One can be that if we take the case of a company, they are required to report under the legislation of Massachusetts, the TURI statute, and that has a cost, and they're looking to save money essentially. So they're looking like, hey, if we switch to this alternative, we may not have to report anymore. That's a win-win for us. So it could be that is the incentive that causes them to come and contact us. It could be that they do it out of their own initiative, that they think that they need to get out of this because other companies or countries are doing that and they should follow. It can be that they've actually gotten in touch with some of our colleagues in the government. There's an Office of Technical Assistance that provides confidential technical assistance to businesses about their needs for safer alternatives and what may be out there and available. Sometimes we're referred businesses or other users of toxic chemicals from them. And sometimes it's in response to the financial support we provide. So a portion of the fees that the TURI program collects, it goes back to businesses, goes to community organizations, goes to academic researchers, all working to find safer solutions to toxic chemicals. And through the requests for proposals and other initiatives around those grants, sometimes we're referred or we come into contact with people that want support.
About the network of how TURI engages, was it built right from the outset, or did the Institute eventually spread its tentacles?
It's more like the latter, although I don't know if tentacles is what I would call it. It sounds kind of dark and devious. We're transparent here. We try to be as transparent as possible. But we have, I think, built on the success of our predecessors, basically. Each success story that we have brings new energy, new people who are excited to work with us, to understand what they can do, how they can collaborate, how they can contribute. And over the years, like I said, 35 years, that has created quite a network effect.
Then if you look at the conversations on this subject within the US and elsewhere, where do you get most inspiration from regarding how to engage, which path to follow, and how the whole ecosystem is evolving?
That would be a good question to ask everyone here. I think everyone has a different source of inspiration. For me, the inspiration comes from those communities who are on the fence line, on the front lines, fighting for their rights to a healthy environment, fighting for clean air, clean water, safe food. Communities, that have gone against all odds to insist that a company change its practices and to compensate for the harms that it has caused. I think for me, that's the greatest source of inspiration, showing that change is possible. I'm also inspired by my colleagues here who have shown time and again that we are not mired in a way of doing things. We're not stuck, even though the inertia may be strong. We're not really stuck. We can do something about this. Solutions exist. I find great inspiration in that.
The solutions landscape, the green solutions landscape that currently exists, if you can give some overview, insight into what that looks like.
Well, I think there tends to be a pattern in this field, if you go back several years, where folks tend to move from one hot topic to another. Right now, that hot topic is PFAS. A few years ago, it may have been flame retardants or nanomaterials, and a few years before that, it was, persistent organic pollutants or something else, mercury. Those are, what I'm naming are actually conventions that have come about, right, at the global level to tackle key elements, in the case of mercury, or chemicals or classes of chemicals. But I think the reality is that both the level of progress that we're making in providing solutions and the breadth and depth of the solutions that are required are not truly quantified. It's very difficult for anyone to say how much progress we're making. And I think if we actually did do that analysis, we might find that we're doing better than we expected, but the challenge is far greater than we had appreciated before.
Yeah, without going beyond local now and not just looking at the national, how would you describe the international policy landscape around issues that TURI is passionate about?
Well, I could talk for a long time about this.
Yeah, I want to make you happy.
Thanks. I think two words come to mind: jointed and fragmented. So we have this patchwork of global treaties to deal with chemicals, waste, pollution at large. They touch upon different stages of the life cycle, different activities, different types of chemicals, in some cases a simple element. It's like if ever there was the need for a strategic plan, I think it would be in the development of these treaties and global instruments. Unfortunately, the global community did create something like a strategic plan. It was called the Strategic Approach to International Chemicals Management. It wasn't given really the time or the funding or the political will, the visibility, the binding legal obligations, or anything that would have made it successful. So, it kind of did its thing for a decade or so, but then has now been replaced by a global framework on chemicals, which has a lot of positive things that were missing from the predecessor of the global framework on chemicals, but still it's non-binding. It's a voluntary framework. And, the global community has so many toxic chemicals, unquestionably toxic chemicals in circulation for which we know there are safer alternatives that, we really need to start the process of phasing those down. And unfortunately, the global community is not ready for that. Countries in Europe, in North America continue to export toxic chemicals, toxic pesticides that they themselves have prohibited from use. But because of loopholes in their legislation, they continue to allow it to be exported to countries where the risks are infinitely higher. The conditions, for example, for pesticides, where they're exporting them, the PPE, the personal protective equipment, isn't available. Even if it was available, the temperatures are so high or the literacy rates are so low that people won't properly use them. If you want to talk about risk quantification, which we at TURI don't really buy into wholesale because of many reasons, the risks are infinitely greater for a country like Sri Lanka or communities in India or Bangladesh, who continue to face incredible dangers and risks, all of which that can be prevented.
What attracted you personally to this sector? And occupying this role, are you still optimistic? What is your optimism like?
Yeah, so I fell into this field or this sector by accident. I was a research chemist, working for biotech and pharmaceutical companies. I went to law school. I was probably destined for a life of contracts or intellectual property. And then the Great Recession hit in the US and no one was hiring lawyers. I found a great nonprofit to work with. And that experience, I didn't actually even work with them. I was volunteering at first. That experience really opened my eyes. It was really an unbelievably eye-opening experience because I had been working for 6 or 7 years with a myriad of toxic chemicals that I had no idea about their actual risks or hazards. And it wasn't until I went to an international conference on chemicals that I was like, oh wow, all these chemicals that I was using on a daily basis have been banned or restricted by the European Union. And then, it's sort of my passion for this topic or this issue grew out of that. I continued to work in the area of international environmental law as it relates to chemicals and pollution. I had the honor and the privilege of being appointed by the UN as a special rapporteur on the topic, and that only motivated me and inspired me more to work on this issue, meeting the communities around the world that were suffering as a result of preventable disasters. The thing that some people are kind of confused about is why I went from working at like the 30,000 foot level for the UN down to essentially a subnational level. And that's in part because, for 6 years or more, when I was with the UN, I was talking about the problems. And I really want to work not just on the problems people are facing, but also on the solutions. And that's what TURI brings, is the solutions. And I truly believe that this is the model that is best suited to the circumstances of low and middle income countries, to be able to work with small businesses in their countries that are supplying brand names around the world to improve their practices, provide safer, more sustainable, healthier supply chains around the world. I think this model that is here in Massachusetts, the TURA model, and TURI in particular, has a lot of potential for solving this problem.
Quick follow-up. What do you think we get wrong from your experience now about working with the private sector? There seems to be this perception that they just want to continue to pump these chemicals into the body, into the people, into the system. But what do you think the approach of TURI, what lessons do you think we can learn from TURI's approach?
I mean, there is some truth to that. You can't deny it, right? Like a company will often look at its bottom line. And even when they talk about sustainability, it comes back to the bottom line because, well, okay, sustainability is great, but actually what we're worried about is the reputational risk, the cost, or the litigation risk, the cost. It's often that you will find an altruistic company out there. But that being said, what I've observed here in Massachusetts is the education that goes into informing people about the toxics that are being used, the hazards, the devastating impacts that it has on people's lives, and the ability to find and develop safer, viable, both economically and technically viable alternatives. It's a powerful thing, and it sticks with people. And so when a CEO or a board member of a company has been shown what is possible, even if it's not truly a win-win from environment and economic standpoint, you can find strong allies that are willing to make a switch, to incur a slight cost to do the right thing.
So, last question, what are you optimistic about?
It's a strange time to be asking about optimism, given everything that's happening around the world. I am optimistic because I think that over the past 15, 20 years, the environmental movement has changed and grown dramatically. It's been remarkable. I mean, I've only been part of it for a small fraction, and even for me to see the change is remarkable. And even if the past couple months or weeks have been pretty dark, I think there's a lot of room for optimism when you take the long look on things. If you're a long-term investor, right? So you got to look at the long term, and I think we are still going in the right direction, although we have a lot of problems to solve.
So talking of the last few weeks, there have been some policy changes. Which ones are you most concerned about? And do you think what you are doing at TURI is immune to what is happening on the national stage?
Oh man, I think just in the last 2 weeks alone, the U.S. government said that they would rewrite something like 30 or 40 environmental laws related to pollution. It's hard to know where to start. I think what I think really gives me the greatest pause in a way is not that these statutes are being rewritten, dropped wholesale, but that what has been sort of a cornerstone of the U.S. in terms of environmental law, respect for the rule of law here seems to be eroding. You see from all levels, from the public all the way to the highest offices, attacks on the judiciary, calling for impeachment, disregard for judicial decisions and orders that are coming out. I find that very troubling because here in the U.S., in some cases we have pretty good environmental laws, but oftentimes they're actually not the best in the world. The European Union has gone far and away above what the U.S. has done in terms of restricting and banning toxic chemicals. But what has been very helpful to the public, at least in the U.S., is the litigation risk. And if you take away the bans and the restrictions and the risk of litigation or the potential, enforcement that can come from the courts, then we're in a really dark place, I think.
So how are you preparing for this potentially dark period? Or do you think the environment sector will need to take a pause until this is all over? When I was talking to someone, like you rightly mentioned, the way he told me they are preparing to take this on is through litigation, go to the court, aggressively asking individuals, members of the communities directly affected to call their lawmakers, to relying on the public and also on the judiciary system. So are these two what you also think is the way forward, or is there a third and fourth option?
And if you can't rely on the courts, I think there is a third and fourth option. It's not something that hasn't been happening already. For example, market-based campaigns, like consumer campaigns, like we demand products that meet this minimum threshold. It's not going to have this chemical, that chemical, what have you. Companies are going to be doing the right thing when it comes to anything, like whether it's climate change or child labor or what have you. I think those sorts of issues are, things that companies are keenly aware of and keen to tackle, regardless of what's coming from the legislature, because they do recognize the purchasing power of consumers. Otherwise, I think that at least on the side of toxics, in the U.S., like our toxics legislation federally, most of the history of the environmental movement has been non-existent. Like, the original Toxic Substances Control Act never really worked. Its 2.0 version that was recently adopted has been sort of like an old car from the 1970s, like sputtering and starting and sputtering and starting, never really moving forward. I mean, I say that because against all that, those 50 years or so, like, it's been the state level restrictions initiatives such as TURI here in Massachusetts that have helped the U.S. to have better standards when it comes to chemicals and products, when it comes to pollution. And, our states are not insignificant. California is like the 10th biggest economy in the world, I think, last I heard. And, it's not something that you would sneeze about, as they say. So, yeah, I mean, I think those are the two others besides the judiciary.
So any close remarks for me? Final thoughts?
I think I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on coming to America in this like huge period of transition. It must be strange looking at us from the outside and how we're coping with this. So yeah,
that's a fascinating perspective. I think you rightly mentioned that the EU is years away from what is happening in the US. I travel across the EU a lot. I go to Paris, Switzerland, and there seems to be widespread acceptance of the need to be intentional about the environment. Nobody's talking about all those COP goals because most countries in the EU, they had already instituted policies. And I think the EU as a structure on its own taking the lead, and all these countries coming together to formulate policies that all of them now localize, even makes it much easier to be able to make those steps. But the US is bigger as a country than the entire EU. So it's an interesting period. And I think TURI itself seems to be playing in that solutions angle, not just advocacy, not just talking about the problems, but potentially working with those that have that problem from the business, from the company perspective to actually develop solutions. Whether those solutions go mainstream or is restricted to individual, organization or company is what we stand to see. Thank you very much. This was fun.